Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
All right, so I watched Bernie Sanders' appearance on Tim Dillon's podcast. He's gone on there before, and they did another episode. Bernie's currently pushing his book, Fight Oligarchy. I guess the oligarchy tour is over now, and so he's pushing a book. And I had seen some clips circulating of Bernie talking about immigration on this and saying that it's good that Trump closed the border and that Biden should have done that, something to that effect. And that was circulating and people were dogging on him for it. So I wanted to see it for myself. And I gotta be honest, I think Bernie didn't do great in this interview. And it wasn't just that moment, but I think in general, what you saw from Tim Dillon in this interview is that he had a lot of very critical points because he just fundamentally kind of disagrees with most of what you would consider civil rights issues at the moment, whether it's those of trans people, those of immigrants. You know, he's pretty consistently against that and postures as though he has an issue with this growing surveillance state, but much like Joe Rogan, continues to advocate for the exact fear-mongering points that have allowed the infrastructure of this heightened surveillance state that we are entering into. And they really just aired out the propaganda that has paved the way for that. No recognition of it whatsoever. And so, more so in this interview than one that he did with Marjorie Taylor Greene recently, you see him coming with a lot of points for Bernie, essentially trying to make points to him about the Democratic Party, which I honestly found kind of unbearable. But the reality is Bernie should have come more prepared for that. And it's possible that because of the format of these podcasts, he expected a little bit more of a casual kind of environment to talk about this book and stuff. But Tim, all of a sudden, wants to play the role of a real reporter that has tough questions to ask. So I just think that that's convenient, given that these podcasts are known for their non-harsh atmosphere. And in his recent conversation with Marjorie Taylor Greene, he was more focused on posturing her as the renegade against the Republican Party, whereas in the case of Bernie, he is answering for the Democratic Party, which he's not even technically a member of. But that being said, because Tim Dillon came with these points that he wanted to make, I thought Bernie could have done better. So I'll get to why in a second, but here's some clips of the conversation.
So my question is there a position that the Democratic Party can take that is obviously anti-people getting dragged out of their houses, but recognizes that citizenship should mean something, that we should have a border, and that, you know, having laws that protect workers is important, and that people employing undocumented workers or illegal labor is driving down wages for Americans?
You've asked a lot of very important questions, good questions. Let's start off with the basic. So long as we have nation states, right, which we have, you gotta have borders, right?
Right.
If you don't have any borders, then you don't have a nation, right? In a sense. So has historically the United States done well under Democrats and Republicans in protecting the border? The answer is no. Trump did a better job. I don't like Trump, but we should have a secure border, and it ain't that hard to do. Biden didn't do it. Those before him did not do it. We should have a secure border, period. I think most people in the Congress agree with that.
Why don't you think he did it, just out of curiosity?
Pardon me?
Why don't you think Biden was more proactive with securing the border?
He did some things. He was not, I think by the end of his term, if my memory is correct, the number of illegal folks coming in had gone down. But I'm not going to sit here and tell you that overall it was a good job. It was not. The truth of the matter is, and one of the things that I really, really dislike about Trump, and what demagogues always do, is this country, as we've discussed, has enormous problems. And what demagogues always do, instead of trying to deal with why we have those problems, what are the causes of the problem, what are the solutions, you blame a powerless minority. In Europe in the 30s, it was the Jews, it was gypsies. In this country, it was gays, it was blacks forever, with Latinos, always somebody to blame. rather than dealing with the real issue. So anyhow, you got roughly 10 million people in this country, most of whom, by the way, work very hard. And according to a number of studies, the crime rate, Trump goes around, talking about, somebody commits a terrible, terrible murder. Trump is talking about, they are lawless, disgusting, subhuman human beings. Look at this crime here. Truth is that the crime rate in communities of undocumented people is lower than the general average. Do you know that?
Well, the crime rate should almost be none, right? If people are coming into America and they are, coming here for a better life, and they're properly screened, the crime rate should almost be nothing.
Well, it is. It's lower. All I'm saying is
Right.
It's not like they're criminals. Everyone's a drug addict.
I don't think anyone thinks everyone is a criminal, and I don't think that anyone. But we do have a ton of income inequality, as you've talked about. So assimilating people into this economic structure is difficult. It is inevitable that some people that cannot find work will turn to crime, and I mean that's just inevitable.
But my only point is this: this is not a community that is prone to large amounts of crime. All right, so what do we do? You got 10 million people here. Most of them are working hard. Your point, I think, is well taken.
Yeah.
A lot of employers exploit them.
Yeah.
And by the way, often these people are paying Social Security payroll tax, paying Medicare payroll tax, paying other taxes, and they don't get the benefits for what they pay, by the way.
Right. Biological men and women's sports, it's just an unpopular issue. Child sex changes, no one wants this. Very few people. Very radical people. And I understand that people have trans children, and I get it. But, this has tremendously hurt the electability of Democrats.
But I think the answer is yes. But the answer also is, why are we not talking about some of the issues that I raised earlier? Why are we not talking about the fact that we are the only major country on earth not to guarantee health care to all people?
Because the Republicans are demagoguing this one issue because it was handed to them on a silver platter by Democrats.
Well, all right.
Yeah, so I want to be clear that in that last clip there, when Bernie says yes, the answer is yes to what Tim Dillon's saying, he's not totally conceding the framing of everything that Tim Dillon is saying there about trans people in general. More so the question was, do you think Democrats have allowed this to take up too much space? And Bernie's saying yes, but. However, I think that Tim Dillon always plays this game where he hides his obvious just conservatism bordering on fascism behind this ability to scrutinize and recognize demagoguery. And so he's willing to point that out in the case of Peter Thiel, and in this case on the part of Republicans, that they're demagoguing. They're using these issues to demagogue. But there's no reckoning with what that means. And every single thing that he's pointing to as being an issue that Republicans demagogue about, or even saying that Peter Thiel and Donald Trump are demagogues that are building a surveillance state, he talks about these issues on his platform every single day without dismantling the framing that is allowing for the construction of a surveillance state on the part of these fear-mongering tactics. And so that's really the main issue with immigration. As far as what Bernie said about Biden should have closed the border, I don't know why he said that. It's one thing to say secure. Then you get into conversations about what that means. Trump, the data shows that crossings, legal and illegal, have slowed, if not completely halted at the border. I'm just not sure where the information's coming from that that's a good thing. The only reason that that's considered a good thing is because of propaganda that is peddled by Donald Trump that this is an invasion. And even in declaring victory over shutting down this border, he's saying we've stopped an invasion. So if you accept the premise that we are being invaded, then it's a good thing to shut down the border. But if you don't accept that premise and you're skeptical of that premise, then all of a sudden maybe it starts to look a little bit weirder that you want to shut down the border and construct a smart wall that is going to monitor the activity of coming across. And the reality for me is that I think people should be documented when they come through, meaning that we should know who's in the country. And the best way to do that is to make it easy and smooth to do so. Instead, what's being constructed is, a draconian way to keep people out of the country and to track people once they are in the country. That's what has been constructed on the back of propagandizing about immigrants that Tim Dillon, Joe Rogan, Andrew Schultz, and Theo Vaughn have done. That's where we're at. And this is infrastructure that's going to last a long time, and stuff that has implications about what people are saying, their free speech, about capitalism and fascism. All of these things are going to be folded into an infrastructure of what allows you to be in the country and not. And it's because Republicans, through figures like Tim Dillon, have been able to construct their worldview across a much wider space. And you really see it with Tim Dillon here when he says, well, if we're talking about the immigrant population, these are people who should be committing no crimes. So that's just like boilerplate conservative reactionaryism, right? Because Bernie's making the point that these groups of people do not commit outsized amounts of crime, which is the basis upon which Donald Trump is implementing his entire immigration policy. And Tim Dillon's response is to say, well, those people should be committing no crime. So where does that put us, where someone's status in our society is what decides how bad it is that they are committing some menial crime or some serious crime, when the whole point is that they as a group of people are not committing those crimes to an outsized degree? And, you know, my main issue with Bernie, I'm not here to like trash Bernie and say he's, you know, so terrible for doing this. I think Bernie's strength and weakness is how consistent his message is. And so what he's really good at is bringing the conversation back to the classic Bernie Sanders message, which no doubt has transformed the political conversation in America, got people talking about healthcare, college, democratic socialism, really pushed the conversation forward in America, no question. And he continues to do that. And it's through consistency. And he is a person who recognizes that no matter what direction people try to pull you in, you got to come back to the same message. But on a platform like this, which is known for the sort of freewheeling conversation, you got to be able and ready to address things in more detail and be pretty flexible about it. And it's possible that Tim Dillon, you know, went harder on Bernie than he was expecting, like I said, when it comes to these kind of hot button demagoguery issues. So Tim is pretending that he is smart enough to know that these are demagogue issues, and yet he's using every opportunity to continue to launder it to his audience because he knows that that's what they want to hear. And I think it's one thing to say we got to talk to these people, there's a large audience there, and, you know, shading ourselves off from people we disagree with has harmed the movement. I think there's definitely truth to that. But at the same time, you got to be prepared for what these environments are like if you're going to go there. And I think Tim Dillon specifically has a more pointed point of view. And it is necessary to be combative on some of these issues. If you're talking to somebody who is targeting immigrants and targeting trans people with talking points that even they themselves are kind of acknowledging aren't actually true, but are just premises for demagoguery, and yet at the same time they are still entertaining those as a means of content, then I think that they require defending. And that's why, even though it's exhausting going through this content, it's necessary at all of these points to defend these people that they're talking about, because what they are pointing to, and ultimately the point that I'm trying to get to here, is that there's a worldview that these people present, and they flesh it out every day on their podcast, and it has lots of different details to it. And that's the nature of this conversation with Tim Dillon and Bernie, is that he's hitting Bernie with all of these things that he's thought about and like all these premises, and Bernie only has so much ability to reroute what Tim Dillon is talking about into this more straightforward, you know, talk about inequality in healthcare. He tends to bring it back to that. That's where he went at the end of the trans clip, where he says, well, okay, he goes back to talking about the healthcare system in general. It's smart, but then in this environment where somebody's kind of fleshing out their worldview to their audience, I think it's more necessary to challenge that worldview and to have specific answers to these questions. I mean, these are questions that Bernie could have known he would bring up, should have known he would bring up. His staff should have prepared him for it, because it's not that surprising that Tim Dillon threw the stuff at Bernie. It's the stuff he talks about on his podcast every day. And so on the left, there has to be a fleshed out worldview on all of these issues. Good answers for all of these questions. If we're going to engage in these conversations, whether they're bad faith or not, we need to be able to present that audience that we're trying to reach with a fleshed out perspective that starts to genuinely challenge and chip away at the perspective that they're used to hearing. And I think a crucial part of that, and it does get brought up here, but only briefly, Bernie mentions climate change. And so this issue of immigration and refugees, and Tim Dillon, of course, mentions immigration and Muslims, you know, assimilating in Europe and the UK. There's no discussion of the actual underlying cause of that, which is disruption often funded by the West and the United States, and also climate change. And it's very, very important for anybody on the left, especially when faced with this conversation about immigration, to start talking about the fact that whatever we consider the immigrant or the refugee crisis now is going to get thousands of times worse. And this surveillance infrastructure that's being set up in America right now is not going to help solve the problem. It might make it so that it's harder to get into the United States, or that you have to pursue more creative means to bypass the system. But ultimately, the problems of destabilization are going to continue, and one way or the other, United States and other countries are going to be forced to take people in. And continuing to ascribe to this logic that public funding and funding for things in society that help people is bad or worthy of skepticism or worthy of means testing, but throwing money towards surveillance and state force, which is what Donald Trump is doing at the moment, that is the ultimate realization of the Republican and conservative power fantasy. You disempower all of the most vulnerable people in society, and you create a top-down repressive state where all the money goes. And so it has to be mentioned that if you're talking about this destabilization of society that you feel is happening because of immigration or whatever, having institutions that are well-funded and powerful is the only solution to that. You want people to not come to America and try to change the culture and do, conspiracies about Sharia law and stuff like that. Well, people need to be educated in civics. And we need to make sure that there is broad education across the country such that people come across the world for that education to this place. And we have to welcome that, because that type of immigration also makes us more powerful on the world stage and makes it so that those institutions are stronger because people come here specifically for that. And you're worried about, all the talk about trans people in sports and trans children, and Republicans are using it to fearmonger. Well, that's because people aren't educated about this subject, because the education isn't funded, the research isn't funded. It's constantly attacked by conservatives and reactionaries who want to break apart people's trust in the systems of science in this country that have been established to make everybody's life more stable. Trust in vaccines was established to make everybody in America's life more stable. And so if people are advocating for the stabilization of society through left-wing progressive policy, the constant reminder that yes, healthcare can be better, and we know that, and that's Bernie Sanders' area of focus, and that's great. But ultimately what it comes down to is a logic that investing in these things, whether it's, comprehensive immigration that assimilates people and, does it seamlessly so that they're not trapped in the system for years, education about science and religion and civics, all of that takes money. And so our number one priority, if you're worried about that destabilization, needs to be how to fund all of those programs across the country so that all of us are in a better position to be informed and be active and live in a healthy society. It's really not that hard. It's really not that hard. But what gets in the way is conservatives and reactionaries who use any tiny scrap of information to agitate against those institutions of science and civics that we have established in this country. And if Bernie's trying to give us a radical vision, any type of radical vision, of how to reformulate those institutions so that they serve everybody better, these people who are talking about breaking up the system every day to massive amounts of people, whether it's Tim Dillon or Steve Bannon, if you're going to go talk to them, you've got to really be prepared to reinforce the institutions and the changes to those institutions that you think are the true answer. And so if we have any chance of recapturing the public imagination, especially using platforms like these, I don't know. I think we're going to have to get a little bit more creative and a little bit more detail-oriented than Bernie was in this interview. That's just my 2 cents.
Pressure getting pressed, do you feel it now? What even happens next, I don't really know. Voice carries less, can you hear me now? Soon as I get blessed, time's running out. Pressure getting pressed. Pressure getting pressed. Feel the pressure getting pressed. Yeah. Pressure, do you feel it now? I'm just saying this.